Hi, welcome to Art by Annamarie, and today is a floating studio demonstration. I'm going to talk to you and show you today a technique which we call a watercolor wash. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Some people think you can only apply washes when your paper is fully dry, and that's true, that's one thing. Today you're going to see how you apply a wet wash on top of another wet wash to create a very moody atmospheric look. First things first, because I share my floating studio with my cats, I have to get rid of the cat bed. For today's painting, you're going to need a paintbrush. I use my Winsor & Newton Pure Squirrel paintbrush to do all of my layering and all my washing, but if you don't have that kind of paintbrush, don't worry, just use whichever one you have. The great thing about this technique is you can just put on an outline of the colour you're using, and then you can use the water and the watercolour to just fill in the rest of the details. And you can see there that my brush actually has quite a fine tip that I'm using as an outline. I find that really helpful, but I also like the kind of outlined design you get at the end of laying the washes. I'm going to skip now to show you how to put a wet wash next to another wet wash and have some of it drip in together but have some of it stay separate. So here you'll see that some of my wash has dried, and I'm adding some very wet wash to the side of my painting. So you want to just make sure that your paintbrush is loaded, and I'm touching right up to my other wash even though it's wet, because the wet on wet wash is really interesting to just let the colors go where they want to go and do what they want to do. I have let my figure dry in the middle, and I might do it again and not do that, but at this point I wanted it dry so that it wouldn't bleed into the actual figure. I just want the color to be able to wash around with itself. You can see that the wet on the wet has taken some of the narrowboat colors up to the top, and some of it has stayed the same. My color palette here, I have a little bit of silver, and what the silver will do, you'll see at the end, I'm just dabbing it around on my very wet layer, and you'll see at the end, I'll show it to you, it's going to spread out all the way over that wet paint, and it's actually going to look like the paper is shining without really having like a giant layer of silver. It's just going to be something extra to catch your eye, which I like to play around with. At this point, if you drop a droplet of water into your watercolor, the pigment is going to rush away from the water, and that kind of effect is really interesting as well. I have a little bit too much water on my narrowboat, so I'm just going to pull some of that color, and I'm going to start on the background, and the background is just going to be different shades of wash. You can see here with this watercolor wash that it has segmented into the narrowboat. So I've layered blacks and oranges and blues, and as they dry, they're drying with their own pattern, and that's something really magical about using this watercolor wash technique. with your own watercolors. And at this point I was really just playing around. I didn't have an image in mind except for the girl on the front of the boat. I don't really have any idea about what to do with the background, so I fell back onto my very useful clouds. There's something that I do quite a lot in my designs. I originally did want it to look like trees, but they kind of just fell into clouds, and so there's a few things that I would do about this painting differently. You can see as well I've put on a really dark wash, and that was a complete accident, so you'll see what to do if you do put on a heavier wash and you really don't mean it. You can take another paintbrush and you can just lift it off, and it's actually really effective to try to get you back to as much of the white watercolor paper as possible. Remember, as soon as you put a wash on watercolor paper, you're never going to have it white again, so you need to really decide which parts you need to stay pristine. So you see here I'm taking a sable brush, not a synthetic brush, because I still want it to be a little bit more gentle, and I'm adding some plain water to spread out the pigment like I showed you earlier, but also I've gone way too heavy with this wash, so the water is going to dilute the color, and because it's so wet I'm able to pull it up quite easily. Just repeating the design over the other side. Take your time with it, make sure you line it up. And again, I'm just keeping a really simple color palette for these washes. I think introducing shades that are similar makes it look a little bit atmospheric. So in this way you've got a bit of a moody contrast. The colors aren't really what they seem, or they're kind of meant to evoke some sort of emotion. Here you can see I've taken my sable brush again to lift up some of the colour. I got the tone of the colour right this time, but what I didn't want to happen, I didn't want any of the darker purple bleeding into the clouds, so I picked up a lot of the water that was right next to the boat with that one brush. I'm going to paint in some negative space here, so I'm leaving my leaves white and I'm just going to highlight behind them. There's different ways to do that, but in this case I think it's a lot more forgiving to do it this way, because if you go through a bit of leaf you can just colour over it. Again, I'm going to keep those white, so you definitely don't want to put another wash on top of it because you can't get back to white at that point. I'm using my sable brush to lift off that colour. And I'm also using the sable brush to add a lighter design, you'll see here. If you press harder with your sable brush or with the brush that's taking off the pigment, then obviously you're going to get a lot more pigment off at that point. So I'm pretty happy with how this is working out. I'm going to let it dry now. It's quite a sunny day in the floating studio, so it's going to dry quite quickly, and then I will show it to you in real time and we can have a look together and see how it dried. And here it is. I'm I'm really quite proud of it. It's the first one I've done in a very long time with just a wash technique, because I do like to put in a little bit of darker detail. There's a few things I'd change. Next time I would start with a darker wash as opposed to when I was thinking a layering wash. And I thought I had gone quite dark, but you can see when it dries it's a little bit lighter. But overall I really like the effect, and I think I'll probably keep it as a sketch or an idea and do another one and maybe try to perfect the technique a little bit, because I do really like playing around with washes. I like how the colour moves. Leave a comment below. Let me know if you prefer this kind of watercolour technique, this kind of washed painting, to my usual style of painting. I'd be very interested to know what you had to say. Thank you so much for watching.